Hello and welcome everyone to tonight's event with 192 Books. My name is Evan. I'm the manager here at 192, and I am so thrilled tonight to be joined by David Joselit and Pamela Lee to discuss their new books, Pamela Lee's Think Tank Aesthetics and David Joselit's Heritage and Debt. These are two incredible books by two of our most wonderful thinkers that we have going today in the art world, and we couldn't be more pleased to welcome them and welcome all of you to this sort of night of thinking and talking through these wonderful books. Tonight, each of the authors are going to give a short presentation on their books and sort of the project behind each of them and what they are proposing in each. And after that, they'll take questions from you, the audience. So if you have a question, you can send it to me at the email below. It's evan@192books.com, and I'll relay that to them. If you have a question now, you can send it. The earlier you send it, the better chance to have it answered. Yeah, so if you don't already know, David is an editor at October and a professor of art, film, and visual studies at Harvard. He's written previous books, including Feedback, Television Against Democracy, and After Art. Pamela is a professor of history, theory, and criticism of light contemporary and modern art at Yale. She's also written Forgetting the Art World and Chronophobia, two wonderful books as well. So first we are going to hear from Pamela, and without any further ado, let's send it over to Pamela.
Evan, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, and thank you to all of you out there in the ether. It's been such a long and fatiguing week, so much appreciated your presence here this evening. I'm going to read a few pages from the introduction with the hope that they will convey some of the texture as well as the spirit of the argument of this book, Think Tank Aesthetics, Mid-Century Modernism, the Cold War, and the Neoliberal Present. So I'm just going to go right into it. Introduction. Encounters. Just what drove the artist to the point where he thought to throw the man overboard? If not to kill him, not exactly, perhaps to cause the former Secretary of Defense grave bodily harm, or maybe give him a really good scare. The last would seem a far more reasonable proposition than the very public murder of Robert Strange McNamara. Of course, in the dismal years of the Cold War leading up to this encounter, reason had long been in eclipse and thought was the least of all things. It was the early evening of September 29th, 1972, and McNamara and the artist were on a ferry to Martha's Vineyard. The artist, a painter, guards his identity to this day. McNamara, on the other hand, had long been a proper name for the records. He was heralded first as a young business professor at Harvard, followed by a stint as a statistical control officer under General Curtis LeMay during the Second World War. Then he was a whiz kid hired by the Ford Motor Company in 1946, culminating in a brief stint as its president in 1960. Soon after assuming leadership at Ford, McNamara was tapped by JFK to revolutionize the Department of Defense. He came armed with the most novel methods and the military logic of operations research and systems analysis in concert with affiliates from a think tank called the RAND Corporation. In 1968, he left Lyndon Johnson's administration to become the 5th president of the World Bank. There, he would transform global finance into a gargantuan debt machine, one that might bankrupt developing nations of the global South, whose politics offended the existing order of things. But who would be thinking any of this out here on the Vineyard Sound, gliding on the Islander as it made its usual 7-mile journey to McNamara's summer home? The Santa Monica offices of the RAND Corporation, a sleek modern complex steps away from glittering views of the Pacific, were some 3,000 miles west. A shadowy crucible of American security and public policy research, home of that cryptic Cold War persona known as the defense intellectual, RAND was a laboratory for the most innovative war games, applied math, computer technologies, and host of related vanguard disciplines with inscrutable names: game theory, cybernetics, systems analysis, operations research. As the crow flies in the other direction, Vietnam was some 8,600 miles east, Chile over 5,000 miles south. In a country even more topographically attenuated than Vietnam, a long petal of sea, wine, and snow, as Paulo Neruda once rhapsodized, the World Bank would exercise its considerable financial muscle, refusing credit to a nation that had democratically elected the first socialist president in the Western Hemisphere. While covert activities were underway to overthrow him, in no small measure supported by the CIA, a cadre of free market economists linked to the University of Chicago, and a consortium of think tanks and other similar institutions. Even so, from where McNamara and the artist stood on the deck, locked in messy, potentially fatal struggle, the Cold War could only have seemed very far away. No, it wasn't as if the artist had planned to kill him. There was no strategy, calculation, or reasoned decision behind his act. No tables or spreadsheets to advance the artist's agenda. No theories of games or stochastic models to plot his course of action. No mathematical formulations or quantitative analysis to justify his move. This was a grossly violent thing, unchecked and spontaneous. Just a surge of poison rage as the artist seized McNamara by the collar and pushed him up against the rails in a failed attempt to chuck him into the sea. Somehow, McNamara would hang on long enough for others to intervene. Just as quickly on the journey to shore, he decided not to press charges against his would-be assassin. And I'm jumping ahead. This book traces the aesthetic connections forged by Cold War think tanks and cognate thought societies. That is, how certain methods and research protocols elaborated in the think tank migrated well beyond its walls. A list of organizations discussed includes the RAND Corporation, the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace, the Mont Pelerin Society, not a think tank per se, but what the economist Friedrich A. Hayek, its founding president, called a study group or thought collective, the Cato Institute, the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, and by association, the interlinked networks of the Cold War University. Their collective and shared research into such military phenomena and the generalization of such methods across the culture are crystallized in McNamara's own diverse professional itinerary. As a former Army Air Force officer, applying the military's most innovative statistical methods to the post-war American corporation at Ford, as a former president in the corporate sector, applying the same to Kennedy's and Johnson's Defense Department, and as the former American Defense Secretary, operationalizing the global economy while helming the World Bank. How such approaches to military, geopolitical, corporate, and social phenomena converge with the interests of the aesthetic mid-century modernism and beyond, running all the way up to the present tense of neoliberalism, is the subject of this book. Think tank aesthetics advances a new reading of modernism's military entanglements, enmeshed further in a peculiar history of interdisciplinary thought. The encounter between the painter and the defense secretary opens onto a set of nested relations toggling between the interests of art, strategy, economics, the hard and social sciences, as well as the humanities. Think tank aesthetics tracks such far-flung relations, and the complex dynamic between aesthetics and the technocratic rationality characterizing the period, unspooling the peculiar connections between defense strategists, computer scientists, psychologists, anthropologists, mathematicians, economists, designers, artists, and art historians. In the process, it also charts a subterranean history of interdisciplinary thinking bearing upon the study of art and visual culture, and points by extension to current debates on the crisis of the humanities in the university. That is, the continued relevance of such disciplines in an institutional culture increasingly geared to laboratory approaches to interdisciplines, if not the interests of the STEM disciplines. This book, in short, is about the Cold War think tank's modernist imbrications, projections, sensibilities, and imaginings, its aesthetic, and the recurrence within the present. The history I tell concerns the way in which research protocols stemming from the era's military imperatives paved the way for its own genre of mid-century modernism, what the historian of science Sharon Gamari Tabrizi has called, in an evocative turn of phrase about the Wren Corporation, the Cold War avant-garde. Okay, I will stop talking there and just say very briefly, I think I have a few minutes, that the roots of this book have a kind of site-specific dimension in that I began researching it in earnest when I was teaching at Stanford University, which you know is at the heart of the Silicon Valley, but also had, at least at the time, an unusual feature in terms of campus planning in that the Art and Art History building was steps away from the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace. And so anecdotal history will recount the presence of such Cold War figures such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn taking up residence in the Art History Library, or from my own personal history will tell you that I saw on more than a few occasions people like Condoleezza Rice within steps of the art history department. And so something about that adjacency was extremely interesting to me. And it went hand in hand with my longstanding interests in the relationship between art, technology, aesthetics, and politics. And so I will end right there. Thank you.
Thanks, Pam. Thanks to Evan and everyone at 192 Books and Paula Cooper-Gowrie for this, this occasion this evening. It's always especially wonderful for me to engage with Pam, whom I've been in touch with in intellectual dialogue with for almost 30 years, hard to believe. And I've learned so much from her. So this makes it especially meaningful. After I read a few pages from my introduction as well, we are going to engage in conversation. That'll be the bulk of the presentation. So I am just going to read a few pages, and then maybe I'll make a few remarks if there's time, and then we'll go into questions. Heritage and Debt proposes a theory of globalization founded in visual art. Art's globalization, I will argue, has the potential to redress Western modernism's cultural dispossession of the global South. Both imperialism and slavery, two primary means of capital accumulation in the 19th century, claimed the inferiority of non-Western cultures as justification for appropriating their land, labor, and the personal freedom of their peoples. While non-Western art was denigrated and suppressed in its places of origin, it was nevertheless appropriated by European modernism in the subordinate position of primitivism or exoticism, or collected as defunct anthropological relics in encyclopedic or national history museums. Global contemporary art has confronted this history of dispossession in its counter-appropriation of cultural heritage as a contemporary resource. The term heritage may seem jarring in this context, since historically its application to non-Western cultures has typically abetted their dispossession rather than combating it, as I am arguing. While European modernism claimed freedom from the ballast of tradition, it relegated non-Western art to a form of heritage that lacked dynamism and contemporary relevance, except as occasionally inspiration for the West's proprietary innovations. By asserting European modernity as universal, and thus not bound, precisely not bound to any particular heritage, despite the fact that numerous modernist movements, such as Cubism, were deeply and self-consciously rooted in the local history of post-Renaissance European painting, The West was emboldened to view all other expressions of modernity as indebted to it, as derivative. Such indebtedness not only underwrote the dual modern institutions of imperialism and slavery by positing subject peoples as not fully human and consequently in debt to their rulers or masters for access to modernity, but continues to characterize neoliberal or neo-imperial techniques of governance through debt, another kind of indebtedness, by loans from international financial agencies such as the World Bank or International Monetary Fund. In my usage, heritage denotes any kind of cultural inheritance passed down anywhere, and thus encompasses both ostensibly traditional practices, which would be colloquially categorized as heritage, such as literati ink painting in China, as well as modern ones, such as op art in Euro-America. Native and post-colonial thinkers for whom tradition is, and always has been, a living resource, have roundly criticized the Eurocentric presumption that heritage is dormant and safely sealed in the past, and thus the antithesis of modernity. In this book, I depend upon these insights to argue that the aesthetic, and often also the economic response to Eurocentrism under conditions of globalization, has been a reactivation of heritage as a resource for inventing alternate genealogies of modernism and diverse experiences of contemporaneity. So heritage is an engine of the contemporary. Fundamental to globalization, then, is a highly consequential cultural recalibration. The West regains its heritage as particular rather than a universal set of traditions, while the global South reasserts its dynamic traditions as contemporary. Global contemporary art is one primary locus of this recalibration. And thus, following Boaventura de Sousa Santos, it is an arena in which what he calls cognitive justice, understood as engagement with and respect for myriad ways of knowing and experiencing the world, may be demanded. So contemporary art can be a site of cognitive justice. This is one of the themes and kind of through lines of the book. As I will argue, the inalienability of heritage as the inheritance of a group, people, nation, or region, rather than an individual's private property, also functions as a unique economic resource under conditions of globalization, where the values of authenticity, which are ever rarer and thus more valuable in a globalizing world, are monetized. In this sense, the capacity for heritage to compensate for indebtedness isn't merely a metaphor, but borne out through contemporary art's worldwide participation in economic development, including in the West. This book does not, therefore, omit consideration of economics and politics, but rather develops its analysis from an account of art's agency within their dynamics, both as a special form of knowledge and as a resource for development, rather than as a second-order representation of these things. The art politics I discern are thus founded not in the solipsistic type of critique much Western contemporary art history celebrates, but rather in art's potential to redress cultural dispossession through the revaluation of forms of knowledge hitherto marginalized in the West. Most accounts of contemporary art adopt one of two forms, global contemporary art, pardon me, either the in-depth study of nations or regions in the global South whose particular practices of modernity have been overlooked, or the broad survey, whose anodyne multiculturalism assembles art from around the world without sufficiently acknowledging, let alone redressing, the histories of conquest and dispossession that precede their appearance in a contemporaneous moment. As significant as the former are, and as essential as they are to the arguments in my book, these new national or regional histories are typically recounted largely outside a comparative global framework. Conversely, surveys of global contemporary art simulate a form of ethnogeographic diversity almost entirely divorced from rich local histories. It is the typology of the biennial exhibition, with its tradition of national pavilions joined to diverse, often thematic survey exhibitions, that has consolidated these two dominant forms for analyzing global contemporary art. Despite their undoubtedly good intentions, these exhibitions sever artists from their heritage in a superficial form of multicultural representations or tokenism. that fails to do justice to their arts histories. In this book, I argue that heritage has emerged as a resource for demanding such justice, because in becoming contemporary, heritage calls for adjudication among several different and often contradictory world epistemologies, histories, and even ontologies. While I believe that the reanimation of heritage can be a progressive tool for claiming justice in a post-colonial world, post-colonial, post-Cold War world, it is undeniable that at the time of my writing, the late teens of the 21st century, claims on heritage are being aggressively deployed to deeply authoritarian ends, often bordering on fascism. The rise of ethnic or cultural nationalisms or populisms across the world, including, of course, in Europe and the United States prominently, substantiates my assertion that the myriad forms of cultural dispossession accomplished by liberal capitalism and global neoliberalism have led to a worldwide reactivation of heritage. But contrary to Eurocentric and modernist prejudice, I believe there are no inherent politics in such reanimation of heritage, just as democracy itself can lean toward radical inclusion as well as promote disastrous programs of militarist neo-imperialism, or as we are perched on a very consequential election, God knows what. In this book, I trace a particular, we do know what actually, I shouldn't be so disingenuous. Anyway, I trace a particular progressive potential and aesthetic use of heritage as it is reframed by what might be called a curatorial episteme. I will argue that curation encompasses what I have elsewhere called the epistemology of search, ways of knowing that are premised on the algorithmic sorting and patterning of vast accumulations of data. As a form of human or bespoke search, curation is now invoked as an organizing concept well beyond the precincts of art, naming a value-enhancing principle of selection for goods ranging from cheese and wine to luxury apartments. In the neighborhood of 192 books, you can see lots of curatorial metaphors for the multi-million-dollar apartments that are on sale in the neighborhood. And aesthetics of curation is not only widespread among globally contemporary artists whose work ranges from aggregation or reanimation of appropriated content to a widespread archival turn in contemporary art, but it also encompasses cultural policies such as the foundation of new museums worldwide, meant to distinguish localities within a competitive global market. But perhaps most importantly, a curatorial approach to knowledge is particularly well suited to recalibrating the relationship between different forms of world heritage in its capacity to hold unlike objects and images together without placing them in a fixed hierarchical relationship to one another. So that's what I wanted to read. And I think that this, this curatorial episteme, what I particularly want to underline is this last thing that I do think, I mean, not every curatorial project obviously shares this quality, but there is a potential for non-hierarchical production of knowledge through curation, because in part, I think because of the spatial potentials of curatorial thinking, where sequence is not necessarily unilateral. So shall I ask the first question, Pam, since my mouth is already moving? I'm trying to think, well, you know, both of us, one thing that is relevant but kind of on the side of these books is that they both came out almost at the moment that the pandemic, you know, began, which is not the, you know, happiest circumstance for the author of a book. But in some ways it's been kind of great because things like this have happened, et cetera. But I wonder if you feel that neoliberalism has changed in some way. I want to talk to you about the aesthetic dimension, but I also wonder if you think that something has happened either with Trumpism as a kind of protectionist form of neoliberalism, if we can call it that the pandemic as a kind of weirdly viral form of, like there's economic seizures, things seize up, but then there's this kind of imaginary of the virus as the sort of, thing to be contained. And so in a weird way, it's kind of like, some of the metaphors of the Cold War in terms of containment, et cetera. So I just wonder if now that we're not in the painful moment of both the sort of shock of the pandemic and also the shock of our books coming out in the midst of it, not to trivialize the pandemic, but if you've had some reflections on this.
Yeah, many reflections, although I'm not sure that I can quite gather them into something completely coherent. I'll try. And maybe it's easier and strange to say less painful speaking to this question with respect to the pandemic as opposed to politics and what's on the very near horizon with the president. I think what you described as the kind of protectionist figure or even an avatar for an even more rapacious form of neoliberalism makes a lot of sense to me. But maybe I'll just talk about it from the ground level in terms of what we do as artists, critics, historians, teachers, and the ways in which even a platform such as the one we're using this evening is both a symptom as well as a mechanism for the ways in which neoliberalism just continues its onward march or spread. Spread, I think, is the better metaphor because like a virus that spreads, like a virus that is ubiquitous, it doesn't have that sense of linearity or geometry or something as perhaps causal as the notion of a march across, different spheres of cultural and economic production. Anybody who's on this call tonight, anybody who has read our work or is engaged in the history of art knows full well the extraordinary impact and devastation that the pandemic has rendered within the university, within the art world, book publishing, the book world. And it is, it feels almost like ancient history at this point to return to that first moment of lockdown when you would hear people sort of, floating that old canard that don't let a good crisis go to waste, or was that the phrasing? Something like that? But you know what I'm talking about, yeah. And I feel that, intensely in the university, and certainly I think that's true of the art world as well, that many of the incursions or the inroads that neoliberalism has made into both public education as well as obviously private education, that if, say, the humanities or the university itself, higher education, was already at a point of crisis, that what has happened in the last few months has certainly exacerbated that and taken advantage of that. And Zoom, of all things, this kind of interface represents just one very small node in this sort of exploding constellation of the ways in which the economics of the crisis are capitalizing upon or running parasitic to what was already well in place. So it's a kind of shock doctrine narrative, except viral. And I know that in your work, David, you've talked a lot about the virus both as metaphor and actuality, and that we live the virus, metaphorically speaking, in terms of the kind of the kind of exchanges that we're having right now by way of media and by way of communication. So that's one response.
Yeah. So I want to follow up on that though, because I do want, that was sort of a, aftermath question, but as you know, I think one of the most interesting things that you've done in this book is to really think about, it's it's a kind of oxymoron, right? Think tank aesthetics, but on the other hand, it's not an oxymoron at all, because it's this, on the one, there is a kind of ambiance of mid-century modernism, but then what you're talking about is much more interesting, which is a kind of logic of pattern recognition, right? That is a kind of, or at least that's one of the kind of modalities that strongly stands out for me in the work, particularly in the chapter on Pollock, but I think throughout. So I just wonder how you think of aesthetics functioning here as a tool or an agent of neoliberalism, and whether you feel like, to what degree is the aesthetic argument detached from an art historical argument? And does that have ramifications for how you see art history? I mean, you teach in one of the great art history departments of the country, of the world, and yet in many ways your work is pushing against the kind of sanctity of the art object.
Thank you. Yeah, it's well, all of the above. So first I would say that part of the strategy or part of the method on my side in terms of thinking about the relationship between think tanks and mid-century modernism and neoliberalism demands of me as the researcher that I engage various methodological approaches that are by no means, that are not art historical, in the sense of having to do a lot of trans and cross-disciplinary work, thinking about history of science, dipping my toes into anthropology, all of these kinds of things. And art history has for a very long time claimed interdisciplinarity as part of its toolkit. I think that few of us would sort of fall back on a certain notion of formalism or iconography to justify what we do. Although parenthetically, I would also add that there's a way in which our interest in form is precisely what helps make a certain kind of claim about the aesthetic here. So yeah, but I guess the aesthetic for me, I wanted to retain that sense of sensibility of ambiance, of something all around, a feeling even, a feeling. Raymond Williams, the structure of feeling even, and to be able to then pinpoint, or at least provisionally, offer some kind of genealogy of how we got to where we are now in terms of the university, the crisis of the humanities, why it is that we fall so easily back on the language of interdisciplinarity, when one of my principal arguments is that in order to be historically responsible to that notion, we have to think about Cold War military strategy as much as, say, the more radical and liberatory claims around interdisciplinarity that I think we more typically associate with, say, post-colonial studies, Black studies, ethnic studies, women's gender, sexuality studies, etc. So I'm looking to the military part of it and that history. The aesthetic, though, to get a little bit into this ambiance, I was very interested in the work of a scholar named Thomas Medsveds, who talks about the think tank as a kind of quote unquote structural blurriness, which is a fantastic phrase that I think gets at the sense in which it's an organization and it's got very particular protocols that it behaves, that around which it's oriented, but its blurriness means that it's able to traffic in many different spheres of cultural and political activity. And that's kind of what I was after. And I have many questions for you, so I don't want to take up too much more time, but I will say that in terms of what art history brings to a topic that might seem to be well out of our, say, academic or disciplinary capacity, I think that in the end, the kind of attention to form and the way in which form and images move and traffic between different audiences, between different demographics, and how form is mobilized by particular institutions, in this case, institutions of power, is what perhaps gives the art historian some purchase on the material consequences of the kind of argument that I'm making here. Mm-hmm. So there's that. But I'd like to ask you some questions now, David. May I?
Okay. Sure.
And may I also say first, because I didn't say this at the beginning, that it's always just an extraordinary pleasure to have these conversations with you, and that we don't have them enough, alas. But okay, so you mentioned this, that we've been working on these books. We worked on these books for a very long time, close to 12 years. And that the timing of their release was perhaps not the best, but this is okay. This is a small thing, given the order of things. I'm interested, similarly, as you were, in what you see X number of months after the fact of the pandemic, how your book might read a little differently, even for you, just given clearly the pandemic, the resurgence in the movement for Black lives, the Trump presidency, all of these things, particularly headed into next week, and just the calamity, the chaos of next week. And it's in your conclusion, you speak to the prospects of how global contemporary art might enable us to become what you call citizens of information. And that seems like such an incredibly charged and powerful phrase, given what information means right now, either as data, as resource, but also as propaganda. And so if you could just tell us a little bit about how you're thinking around these terms and where this book sits now.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, I've been thinking a lot with my terrific group of graduate students in my seminar this semester, which is about the boundaries and the outside of the human on some level, from Foucault and outward to Mbembe, Sylvia Wynter, et cetera, et cetera. And what has become clearer and clearer to me about this book is that the core issue that matters to me is about how different groups or individuals make claims on cultural properties as their own or those of others. And I think about these with all the controversies that you and I have discussed at great length with regard to the Guston show, for instance, which was supposed to open at the National Gallery. These questions of what it means to show images of KKK, what it means for Dana Schutz to show images of Emmett Till, what it means to be, to virtue signal, for instance, which is the problem that a white person like me who feels he's an ally to Black Lives Matter, I think we have to be really vigilant about this. And so my book is about globalization, but really what it is about, I think the core issue, which is very fundamental to globalization, is this kind of agonism over claims to cultural property. Like, who has the right to claim Aboriginal painting, for instance? The Australian government certainly did it, with great gusto, despite their actions toward Aboriginal people. I've been thinking more and more about, actually, it's kind of a methodological issue that goes very theoretical, which is the question of representation. Like, who do you include in a book like mine, but yours too, but mine is it's really not a survey, but it has a desire to indicate a kind of broad purview, and therefore the representative figures, as it were, like any artist that you choose or any thinker you choose is going to be on some level representative. And I think, to what degree is the position of being a representative and representing, a condition of disfigurement, for instance, as Achille Mbembe might say, or is it, a position of freedom? I mean, I think these are, and this really changes, depending on what your ethnicity is, whether you're in the North or the South, what your class is, et cetera, et cetera. And so I feel like this, globalization has accelerated a certain kind of conflict over cultural property. But I think that that set of conflicts is certainly, it hasn't left us. I mean, I think that, it's too early to tell, but probably globalization will change. Whatever it meant will probably mean something different. And then just quickly, I didn't address the question of the profile, which is the citizen of information is someone who transforms himself from a profile to an active aggregator or curator of information within a kind of embedded perspective. And it's very much indebted, this concept, as many of you will hear, to Ariel Azoulay's idea of the citizens of photography.
May I follow up?
Yeah.
Because if you could surface for us just a little bit your thinking around questions of cultural appropriation in particular, I think, given the heat of those debates recently, and the chapter in your book in which you speak about the ready-made and cultural property, if you could maybe say a few words or draw together the connection between some of the more, and they're not terribly historical, but the earlier examples and some of the conversations happening around cultural appropriation now.
Yeah, I mean, I make an argument that what was at stake for Duchamp was the definition of art, as Thierry Dudouve and others have argued. But then the ready-made has become almost as ubiquitous as photography in contemporary art practice. And so I try to give a genealogy of the ready-made, and basically the middle term is the sort of semantic one. When I think of someone like Tom Wesselman or artists in the 60s who are creating almost rebuses, as Rauschenberg, titled a work, important works, with ready-made materials. So this is a kind of semantic disposition of the ready-made, as opposed to the idea that the ready-made is somehow creating a rupture, and a kind of definitional rupture. And then in the subsequent moment, I think it's really about cultural appropriation. And so to me, the moment of global contemporary art is about both the appropriation within local culture of its own heritage, but then the appropriation for export, for expropriation. So there's a kind of inside, outside, as it were, local, global. Okay. I see we have a few questions, but I had another question for you, which was the opposition that you make in the beautiful passage that you read at the beginning between the artist and the defense secretary, between the artist and McNamara. Now, I've read this myself and I've heard you read it, but tonight what really struck me was these two archetypes, kind of. And in a way, I wonder, I mean, do you think these archetypes have fused in at least some artist practice? I mean, we both know certain artists who might be more like McNamara than the enraged painter, who's kind of like, sounds like a Pollock, the sort of drunken, full of passion type of idea of the artist. So what do you think? And then we'll throw it to Evan for some questions from the audience.
Yeah, I think that they are they are theatrical figures. I mean, obviously McNamara is not just a theatrical figure, but they do kind of play the role, the stand-in roles for, you know, the age-old two cultures debate between the sciences, say, and the humanities or the creative arts. But I suppose that one large thread of the book is exactly what you've just described, which is the growing proximity between these two, and in particular, the way in which a figure like McNamara and what he represents means to recuperate from the figure of the artist. So then the notion of creativity, the notion of innovation, all of these qualities that we attribute and romantically to the figure of the artist become ever more generalized within the rhetoric of neoliberalism. So creativity, innovation, all of these things, all these qualities that were the former domain of the artist, sort of mythically imagined, have now very much been interpolated into the larger into larger culture. And this does have to do with, I mean, the flip side of that would be the artist who is compelled to sort of retool themselves as entrepreneurial subject, as figure of human capital, if nothing else. So sure, I think I couldn't let that anecdote go because it's so powerful.
It's pretty great.
Yeah. But I think by the end of the book, you get a sense at how much the gap is closed between.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we should probably open to the questions, but there's one thing, when you talk about the case in Chile and this amazing, all of you out there should buy Pam's book, but this one chapter is so fascinating where this kind of amazingly science fiction type cybernetic apparatus is used in order to create a kind of transparent socialist economy in real time. It doesn't ever really function, right? But that's and what I love about that story too, is how the right and the left, the neoliberal and the socialist come together. And we talked about this before a little bit, but there's a way in which these political, almost the way I want to think about heritage as being able to have a kind of progressive and also a super regressive dimension. You know, I mean, in some ways, the sort of reliable political poles feel like they're kind of curling in on one another in some of these instances. And it's also a great ambiance, that particular, because it's a great modernist, sort of 70s modern, right?
It is. It's cyber sign for those who are interested. Shall we take some questions?
Yeah. So we agreed beforehand that I would read the questions out. So I will. Taylor asks, what do you make of the recent move toward deaccessioning at major museums, some under the guise of improving the museum's holdings of underrepresented artists? Is the pandemic a sort of convenient crisis for the neoliberalized museum? That's a really terrific question. Do you want to start with that?
I'll start with the last question. Is the pandemic a sort of convenient crisis for the neoliberalized museum?
Yeah.
I think so. And it's, I mean, I don't mean to be glib about it and just say, yeah, of course, but it does seem that, again, in the spirit of where museums were prior to the pandemic, and the other analog would be higher education, that the pandemic has accelerated or provided the kind of limit condition for how museums may well rationalize these practices. What do I think of towards deaccessioning at major museums, some under the guise of improving the museum's holdings of underrepresented artists? I think this is a question for both of us because it gets back to that issue around representation and what representation might mean in terms of the museum? Does it mean at the level of an image that does the kind of performative work of suggesting that the institution has fully understood its relationship to those who are underrepresented, which I would say no? Or is it, I think the phrase is it inclusion or enclosure? And I think oftentimes we could fall on the side of enclosure to the extent that having, say, a lot of new work by artists of color does not necessarily, in fact, it does not necessarily change in any meaningful way the structure of the museum and the kind of governance that might have brought it to that point in the first place.
Yeah, I'll start with the deaccessioning because it's actually something that really interests me. And I've been trying to think about why people are so angry about this, the deaccessioning. And I was starting to wonder whether it breaks a kind of social contract between the museum and its public. And I don't have a fully formed thought about this, but I feel like somehow the museum is understood to be this figure of eternity, right? And I think it's more about that than like the Warhol or the Martin that's being put on the auction block. But I don't have more to say about that, but I think that this is a very interesting pressure point, this deaccessioning one. Now, in terms of making this a zero-sum game, I couldn't, like we can't have artists of color unless we sell some of, some of the expensive works that we already own, the so-called masterpieces. I find that a little bit, I understand that times are hard for everyone, including for museums, but it's also about prioritization. It's the way I feel about when you say to people, museums should be free, and they say, well, they can't afford it, but they can afford all kinds of other things that they want to do. So I kind of feel like, well, why does buying art by people of color have to be a state of exception? Do you know what I mean? Like that's the only way it can happen. And there's something, even though I know that the spirit is in the right place, so it's kind of unfair maybe to make this critique, but that's what critics are allowed to do, really. We're allowed to make impractical critiques. And, and I do think it's worth thinking about. Why it has to be the zero-sum game. Anyway, is there another question, Evan? Okay, Sam asks for both of you, which critics or writers do you find your books to be most in conversation with? Was there any particular work, either from another writer or artist, that surprisingly influenced the direction of your books? I could, since I mentioned two of them today, Boaventura de Sousa Santos was really important for me in terms of this question of cognitive justice that he develops. I mean, it goes without saying that Pam's work is a major interlocutor, but and also Ariella Azoulay, whom I mentioned, because in both cases, I found a model of thinking an economy, a vision that in itself is political without it having to be routed through representation. So the idea of Azoulay is that anyone who takes a photograph is part of an imagined community of photography. And I've assigned this book, it's different books that she elaborates this argument over. But, students are often, a little bit critical. They say, well, who assigns these rights? But the fact is that citizenship can be claimed without the rights being given. In fact, that's a form of citizenship that people like Etienne Balibar theorize that is super important. And so I think the idea that that when you enter the arena of photography, you enter with a set of rights and responsibilities was to me very inspiring.
Thank you for the question. I think the scholars whose work was extraordinarily influential, that I read seriously as model kind of scholarship in kind of interdisciplinary research, were all historians of science, actually. So Sharon Gamari Tabrizi, I mentioned her earlier, a historian of science who wrote a fantastic book on Herman Kahn, who is one of the most controversial and strange characters associated with the RAND Corporation. Eden Medina, whose book on cybersign and cybernetic technologies in Allende's Chile was, it's a really fantastic book, and becomes, I rely upon it heavily in the chapter that David mentioned earlier for the extraordinary research that she did. And Peter Gallison, for many, many things he wrote, but in this instance, particularly for his work on the unity of science movement in Vienna, and then its sort of outreach in United States and England, and the ways that the unity of science movements then come to inform a certain kind of model for interdisciplinary organization that the think tank will take up. So those are three of the most heavily cited scholars in the book. Architectural historian Reinhold Martin, very important work on pattern thinking. That would be another figure as well.
One last question, Jeff. Jeff asks, David, you talk about how heritage is being unearthed to combat Eurocentrism and tokenism in curation. How might one go about creating a non-hierarchical curatorial episteme when archives are already so heavily biased? Another great question. I think precisely by indicating the bias. I mean, you know, this is one of the great strategies of artists who have entered archives from Fred Wilson on down, that there is a way in which you don't enter the archive as a kind of encyclopedic authoritative collection. You enter the archive as itself a kind of even proto-aesthetic curation of things. I mean, this is, you know, I guess my intellectual orientation is very Foucauldian in many ways. And so, you know, the archive is a set of discursive regularities, even if they're kind of not fully disciplined in their archival state. And so part of doing archival work, I think, Akram Zatari is an amazing artist who has worked through archives in very complex ways, and who doesn't take the archive as a ground, but kind of, his work is almost a performance of embedding a ground, making a ground that is purposely understood as fictional, or at least provisional. I think that could be a question for you too. Do you want to answer as well, since it's the last question?
No, I think it's directed to you, David.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Evan, are we just, oh, there he is.
Feel free to say your goodbyes or anything, last words.
Well, thank you. This has been a real pleasure and privilege to discuss our work together, and for all of you. And thanks again, Evan, and 192 Books.
Yes, many thanks. We really appreciate the opportunity, and for all of you who've been listening, thank you so much. Take care. Have a good evening.
Thank you to both David Joselit and Pamela Lee for that. That was so thought-provoking and so wonderful. We have both the books here in store, Think Tank Aesthetics and Heritage and Debt. We are open every day for browsing, socially distance everything, from 11 to 5 until 6 on Fridays and Saturdays. As Pamela said, it's always wonderful to just have a conversation with no center and just talk about anything. And so I feel privileged that we got to watch that tonight. And if you wanted to share that with a friend, we'll have a recording of this posted immediately after. So send a link around. All our events are posted on our website if you want to watch or you missed one. If you can't make it down to Chelsea or you're just somewhere else in the world, we can also order the books from our bookshop.org page. There are links below. Our next event is November 10th at 1 p.m. It's going to be with Cecily Brown and Courtney Martin on Cecily Brown's new catalog from Phaidon. So mark that on your calendars. Should be a good one. And I think everyone have a good weekend. Please vote, get involved, do whatever you can, and we will see you soon. Have a great night.
Good night.
Good night. Thanks, Evan.
Thank you so much. That was great. We had, I think, 60 people watch.